We are live. So good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from, everyone. My name is Jesse, and I am with Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants. For those joining us for the first time, and there are some classes today joining us for the first time, we are all about bringing conservation, adventure, and science into classrooms around the world. And we are really excited today to present the third type of presentation by Banff National Park. We'll get to them in just a minute. But first, I want to give a chance to our sixth classes joining live to give a bit of a hello and an intro to themselves. And so we are joined by Miss Oster's grade 4s in Spruce Grove in Alberta. Hi, guys. Hi, welcome in. We've got Miss Hodder's grade 4s in Calgary, also in Alberta, of course. Hi, guys.
Say hi, they can hear you.
Hey, everyone. We've got Miss Reeves, grade 4s in Leamington, Ontario, joining us for the 150 millionth time. Hey! It's not really a session if Miss Reeves' class isn't there, I don't think. We've got Miss Coyle's grade 6s in Edmonton in Alberta. Hi, guys. Hey, awesome. We've got Miss Adamson's grade 7s in Mississauga, Ontario, and a whole bunch of classes joining them today. Welcome in, guys. There are so many of you. Holy! Did you get the whole community? All of Mississauga is in that classroom. All right. And then last but not least, we've got Mr. Doty's grade 6s in Flemington in New Jersey. Let me just get their mic. There we go. Welcome in, guys. Hi.
Yay, hi.
Hey. I like that we went from a class of like 150 students to a class of like 6. That's awesome. Of course, the reason you guys are all here today is for our speaker. So we are joined live in Banff National Park, one of the most beautiful and storied and iconic natural spaces in Canada and indeed the world. Joining us for the third kind of session they've ever done with us. And so we're really excited today to be joined by Alexandria Jones. So she is going to tell us a little bit about conservation in action and fire management in Banff National Park. I don't want to spoil it. There's a lot of really neat stuff to cover. So without further ado, thanks so much for joining us, Alexandria, and take it away. Yeah, good to
Hi,
go.
everyone.
Hi.
Hi. It was so cool to see all of you guys. If at any point during the presentation it gets a little glitchy, just let me know and I'll try and slow down. My name is Alex and I'm a fire communications officer here in Banff National Park. And what I do for a job is basically educate people about the role that fire plays in Banff, as well as during times of wildfire or prescribed fire, I actually give information to the public so that they stay informed and safe during fires. So let's get right into our presentation. I have some cool slides to show you, so I'm just going to pull that up here.
Very cool.
There we go.
And you're good to go.
Yeah. Good to go. It's just going to catch up here on screen, I think. There we go. All right. So today's topic is conservation in action. So rekindling the spark in Banff National Park, how we brought fire back to the park. But before we can really get started, it's so important to acknowledge that we're currently in the territory of Treaty 6, 7, and 8 First Nations, as well as the Métis Nation homelands. So these lands and waters here in Banff have been used for millennia, so thousands of years by different Indigenous groups, whether it was for sustenance or ceremony or even travel. So there's a very long-standing connection to these lands in Banff that's so important to acknowledge. And we want to thank these different groups for their stewardship and for sharing these lands with us today. Now, what I'd like to see is if everyone on screen, can you raise your hand if you've ever been to Banff National Park? Anybody out there?
Nice.
It's a far way to travel. Yeah. Banff is super popular here in Alberta, but for a lot of people, it's quite a long way to travel. So I threw the map up on screen. You can get an idea of where I am today. You can see Banff is within Canada, within the province of Alberta, and it's actually within the Rocky Mountains. It's about an hour and a half west of the city of Calgary. And so Banff is super cool. It's very accessible to a lot of people because it's so close to an urban center. But the greatest part about it is Banff is actually Canada's first national park, which makes it 134 years old today. That's a long time, I think. Now, Banff is only one of many national parks across Canada. You might have been to a national park, a national historic site, or even a marine conservation area back where you're from. If you have a look at the map, all of these places are amazing, they're all beautiful, and they're all worth checking out. But today, because I'm in Banff, we're gonna focus on Banff because it's super cool. So Banff National Park is pretty amazing for different reasons, and those reasons are very personal to different people. So for thousands of years, people have been moving through these lands. We call it for millennia, that's for thousands of years, like I said, and nowadays, people are still coming to our park, but they're doing it for a few different reasons. They might be coming to the park to see our beautiful wildlife, like grizzly bears. Now, that's a big grizzly bear on screen. He's actually our biggest bear. They might also come to our park to see the beautiful lakes, those turquoise colors in the water. And on the screen is Moraine Lake, arguably one of our most popular spots in the park. People might also come to the park to connect with nature. So once you're out in the trees alone, you can really connect with nature, but also sometimes people just want to connect with themselves. So Banff is such a special place for all kinds of reasons, and I'm so lucky to live here in the mountains and to work for Parks Canada. Why is it cool to work for Parks Canada? Well, we are the caretaker of the national parks, and we look after Banff. As an agency, what we do is we work to ensure that this place stays special for not only present generations like you and me, but also for future generations. So for our grandchildren and our grandchildren's grandchildren, we want to make sure that this place stays protected and special, and that we maintain something called ecological integrity, which is kind of a gross word because it's really big. And what does that actually mean? Ecological integrity is essentially making sure that Banff is healthy and that all of the parts are functioning the way that it should. And when everything functions together like a perfect machine, what we see are healthy waters, healthy wildlife, healthy plants, and of course, healthy people. But one thing that hasn't been functioning properly for quite some time is something called the fire cycle. Now, the fire cycle is another wonky word that only parks people really use, but what it means is the time between fire on the landscape. So here in Banff National Park, using this graphic on the screen as an example, what happens is every 50 to 100 years, we used to experience really large stands, so tree replacing fires. And what happens is all of these really old, dead, dying trees, well, they'll catch fire, they'll burn down, and what we're left with is this really fresh, new, luscious vegetation. So that beautiful grass. There's still logs on the forest floor, so there's habitat for wildlife, but now there's space for other things to grow. And over time, as the century goes by, trees will start to grow up again, and suddenly we'll get lightning, and we'll get another fire and start the cycle over again. It's like the circle of life, the fire cycle. Think of it kind of like Mother Nature doing some spring cleaning every century or so. It's so important here in the park. Now have a look at the screen here, once it pops up, of course. So here in the park, what we used to have is very open spaces. We used to have a mix of forest, but also a mix of meadows and grasslands. So if you can see my mouse on screen, what I'm pointing to is Valley Bottom. So if you can't see that mouse quite yet, it's the valley bottoms, the little dip in the mountains. You'll notice that that area is really light in color. Well, that means it's open. There's not a lot of trees. Whereas if you look near the top of the screen or the bottom, you'll see those shaded in areas. That is forest. And what we see here is a very healthy ecosystem because it's diverse. There's habitat for all kinds of wildlife. If they need open meadows, well, they have it. If they need forest, they also have it. Now, over the past century, what we've actually ended up with is something like this. And when it pops up on screen, you'll notice how many trees have actually grown in. And it's very dark now. Once it pops up here, it's a little lagged. The suspense is killing me. There we go. So what you see is a ton of forest, which is unfortunate because we've lost that diversity in our landscape. It's almost entirely forest now. And although we like to be in the forest, having only trees is actually unhealthy. So just for reference, we'll go back one more time just to have a look. Look in those valley bottoms. Here we go. And what we've ended up now, again, is a ton of forest. So this is the reality here in Banff, and this is why we're talking about why fire is so important. There we go. So I guess the big question is, how did we even get here? In order to understand that, we actually have to go way back in time to talk about how people's changing values and personal beliefs actually altered our entire ecosystem here in the park. People are pretty good at changing ecosystems if you haven't noticed. And so, to start, like wind and rain, fire has actually always been a part of the landscape here in Banff National Park. And with each passing of wildfire, what we see is new life popping up and birthing into the world. So fresh life starting after something that might seem so disastrous, so scary. It's really a catalyst for change. And for thousands of years, people actually coexisted with fire. They knew fire was important. They understood that without it, nature was unable to thrive. And instead of treating fire like an enemy, indigenous groups actually used fire as a tool. And what they used fire to do was they would set fire to the ground and it would open up trails so they could travel more easily through the old forest. They would also open up meadows like what you see on screen here, and it would attract all kinds of wildlife. And the animals you see on screen right now, well, that's a perfect example. So what happened in this area was a fire came through, and within a couple weeks, and then this is a couple months later, the grass started to pop up and all kinds of wildlife was attracted to the area. This was really important for different indigenous groups because that means they now have a food source. Everything's healthy, the wildlife, the plants, and the people. Fire shapes our forests. What it does is it clears away these really old, dead, diseased, and dying trees, and it opens up meadows and grasslands, allowing sunlight to reach the forest floor. So this in turn makes better growing conditions for all kinds of new wildlife, like the elk on screen. But fire, it can sometimes be a little scary, understandably so, especially when you see on the news fires that affect communities. It can be very damaging. Now, when this image pops up on screen, what I want you to do is have a look at it and just think how it makes you feel. And what you're going to see is a forest that has recently, very recently, experienced fire. You're going to see blackened trees. You're going to see soot on the ground. It's very dark. It's kind of bleak looking. So have a look at that image. How does that make you feel? Now, when I look at it, I don't see a ton of life out there. There's no green, there's no wildlife. It's really dark. It's kind of like out of a really dark fairy tale almost. I don't know how this could be a good thing for the forest. But in order for a forest to regenerate, this actually needs to happen. Because believe it or not, underneath that darkened soil, there's actually some protected layers underneath. And those protected layers, they're actually getting new nutrients. And so the soil beneath the soot is actually becoming healthier, even though we can't see it with our eye. Now, to go back to the 1800s, when settlers first arrived here in the Rocky Mountains, fire started to disappear from our landscape. That's when we started to see people really not liking fire. Our values and our beliefs were really shifting here on the landscape. And what they were worried about is that fire was going to destroy their homes. They were worried that fire was going to destroy their businesses, their livelihoods. It was really threatening to their families. And understandably so, if we think back to that previous image with the dark trees, that's what they were worried about. And by 1909, so about 100 years after they first got here, the Canadian Park Service, which is what Parks Canada is today, started to hire our first park wardens. And what they were called is fire and game guardians. Now, these fire and game guardians were tasked with many different things, but one of which was to extinguish every single fire that started. Now, in a park that's over 6,000 square kilometers, which is something like 8 times the size of the city of Calgary, it's a huge space with tons of mountains and forests. That was a big task, putting out every single fire. But at the time, they knew it was important because so many new homes were being built, towns were being established, and they had to protect that to ensure that the people were prosperous. And the locals, all the businesses, well, they were relieved that the Park Service was taking this so seriously. They started to feel safe in a very wild place. And over time, the ability for the fire and game guardians to put out fires became so much more effective. Just like technology advances every year, it was advancing back then too. I mean, on the screen, we already see a vehicle, a fire truck essentially, but go back 100 years and this is what people were using once it pops up. So technology has really come a long way. This is an old school fire truck, folks, a horse and carriage with some hose. So as you can see, that technology was so important in the mountains, because if you had to put out a fire on top of a mountain and you only had a horse, well, that wasn't going to work very properly. So the invention of technology really helped them suppress or put out every single fire. And that's how we got to where we are today. Now, the image that will pop up on screen is what our forests currently look like. Basically, we're full of very dead, old, dying trees that are starting to fall over. There's very little diversity, very different variety in the amount of plants that are growing there. You'll see some moss on the ground, but there's no grass. There's only 1 or 2 types of trees that I see there. Where are all the grasses? Where are all the flowers? Where are the different kinds of trees? And that's what we've lost. These forests, because of fire suppression, have just grown and grown and grown, and Mother Nature hasn't been able to come in and do her job, that spring cleaning of the forest. And so plants that rely on sunlight stop growing. Because what happens is as the trees start growing up and up, they block the sunlight coming down to the forest floor. And so these little saplings that need the sun, they're not able to grow. And so we start losing them off of the landscape and they disappear entirely. And because these trees are so close together and they're dead and dying, they get very dry. And what happens is if lightning hits a tree, they catch fire and they go poof. And the fire catches instantly, and that fire spreads through the forest very quickly. So it's so important that we clear out these dry, old, dead trees, because otherwise we get really severe wildfires like we've seen across the province of Alberta and in many other places in North America. And this is something that we do want to avoid, these very severe, life-threatening fires. Now, close to 100 years after the park was first established in 1885, Parks Canada was really seeing the negative effects of historical fire suppression, putting out all of those fires. We started to see all the bad stuff that was in our forest. And we thought, and we thought, and we knew that fire had to come back some way. Fire needed to restore the balance in our forests. We just really didn't know how that was possible. So they thought, and you know, maybe if fire starts naturally, say lightning hits a tree up in the mountain, maybe we can just let that burn, and that fire can help us clean out the forest a bit. But what if that fire gets really big? And what if that fire starts moving towards town? And what if it got too close to people? How could we possibly let fire be on the landscape that way? How can we control something that by nature is wild? So they thought, and they thought, and they researched, and then they discovered something called prescribed fire. Now, prescribed fire is an intentionally lit fire. So we light something on fire on purpose under very controlled conditions by very trained people in order to achieve a goal, usually forest health or community protection. Now, think of it this way. A prescribed fire is basically like a doctor prescribing you something to feel better. What you do is you go to the doctor and you say, I'm feeling really crummy, I need help. The doctor listens to your concerns, your symptoms, they do some research, They figure out the best course of treatment, and they give you a prescription. And on that prescription, it states exactly what you need to do to feel better. You need to take this medication twice a day, in morning and at night, no more, no less. So you take that medication, after a while, you feel better. That's what prescribed fire is, trying to make the forest feel healthier, the people feel safer under very controlled conditions. Now, after Parks Canada's first intentionally lit fire, which was at Tujack Lake in 1983, the prescribed fire program in Banff only went from there. It was really amazing. Now, for reference, prescribed fire at Tujack Lakeside in 1983 was pretty crazy. Because if we look at the map on screen, the town of Banff to Tujack Lakeside is only 15 minutes away from, people. Does that not seem crazy to light a fire? Something that we'd had never done before. I know nowadays people will be like, whoa, Parks Canada. But thankfully, these guys did their research. And because it was so successful, it's actually paved the way for our fire program today. And we can thank them for that, because nowadays we get to do prescribed fires every year. So if we look at the screen here, this is a prescribed fire that happened a few years ago near Castle Mountain in Moose Meadows. So you can see, actually, I'll use my mouse here. So once that pops up, just off to the side, there's the Trans-Canada Highway. Now, this highway goes through the national park, and it's very busy. There's tons of people on that highway. So the fact that we can light an area on fire so close to people under very controlled conditions is all thanks to that first prescribed fire in Banff in 1983. So thank you guys. And now every year we'll try and do a prescribed fire, usually in the spring or in the fall, again to restore ecosystem health. And one of the coolest parts of the program, I think anyways, is if you look at the helicopter, what you'll see is something dangling down from it. And that, my friends, is something called a heli torch. Now this heli torch will fly over trees, and inside of it is this gasoline and diesel mix. And as it leaves the nozzle, it's actually ignited on fire. And what we're doing is we're essentially dropping fire from the sky onto trees, which is kind of metal, I think. What it does is it keeps our staff safe out of the forest, ensuring that everyone is nice and safe up in the sky, and that we can still achieve our prescribed fire. So it's so important to note that prescribed fire takes a ton of work, a ton of planning, and a ton of expertise. Fire is not to be taken lightly. If not used properly, it can lead to the loss of property and even life. That's why we take it so seriously. But when used properly, it can restore its natural role in the forest by clearing away the dead, old, dying vegetation. It recycles nutrients back into the soil. It opens forests and meadows, allowing the sunlight in for those sun-loving plants. And ultimately, it reduces the risk of severe wildfires because all those dry, dead trees are now gone. Ultimately, fire keeps communities safer. It keeps ecosystems healthier, and it helps us restore function in our park, ultimately restoring ecological integrity. And that, my friends, is how we rekindled the spark in Banff National Park. Thank you, guys. That was awesome. I am stoked.
You are stoked. I like the description of the helicopter with flames is metal. Thank you for that.
Yeah, no problem.
If you want to come out of screen share, we'll dive right in with questions. We've got 8 groups watching on YouTube from all over Ontario, North Carolina, New Jersey, and more. So if you guys want to type in your questions, please do. I'm looking very, very forward to them. But yeah, let's dive in, starting with Miss Oster's class. If you guys want to kick us off with a question, come on up.
Okay. Sorry.
Take your time, no worries.
Has there ever been a fire in Banff National Park?
Yeah.
Yeah, there has been. We've had plenty of fires, both wildfires and prescribed fires. For example, this past summer, we had a prescribed fire, so an intentionally lit fire back in the backcountry where the bison are. And what we did is we made better bison habitat. We've also had wildfires near Sunshine Ski Resort, for example, and we've worked closely with the province to try and extinguish that, and in some areas allow fire to burn because it wasn't threatening anything. So Banff is no stranger to fire anymore, thankfully. Thanks for asking.
Yeah. All right, Ms. Hodder's class, if you guys want to come up next, go for it.
Sure, yeah. Austin, do you want to just come up and talk to the screen?
Do the prescribed fires have an effect on greenhouse gases?
Great question.
That's a great question. Yeah, so there's been a lot of work lately figuring out how fire affects greenhouse gases, how it contributes to climate change. And what we found is when we do smaller prescribed fires every year, what we do is we lessen the chance of a very large, severe wildfire down the road. So these small wildfires, they will release some gases, some smoke, which can be harmful, but it's done under very controlled conditions so that the smoke goes up into the sky, and it's for short periods of time. Compared to a wildfire that might have a bunch of smoke for months and contribute to climate change and greenhouse gases in that way. So it's a bit of both, but prescribed fire is a better way to control it. Good question.
Great question. All right, Ms. Reed's class, if you guys have another one, come on up.
Hi, my name's Adam, and I have a question. On the heli torches, how does all the oil for the fire be contained without burning through the plastic metal?
Yeah.
That's a good question. So the heli torch is made out of a special kind of metal. So it's kind of like a gas can. So the gas in diesel, it doesn't eat away at the inside, and it holds it. And when it comes out of the nozzle, that's when it's ignited. So that's when it catches fire and falls down. So it's quite safe when it's in that little canister, like a gas can in your car.
Yeah. Actually, you mentioned gas and diesel, and that was a question passed along online. So Freehold High School, environmental watching from New Jersey, they wanted to ask how much gasoline or diesel, or what is the exact fuel that they're using and how much of it is used to light these fires?
Yeah, so I was fact checking this morning, and it's approximately 3/4 gas and a bit of diesel. It kind of depends on the person mixing it. Sometimes it's 7 to 3. So approximately 3/4 of it is gas to diesel.
Yeah, and then how much, like the actual container itself, how much is in there?
That's a great question. I don't know if I could give you liters, but it's they're quite large. I don't even know if I could do it on screen here. Think of like 2 2-liter pop bottles wide.
Okay, so we'll
and maybe just as tall.
if you're able to get us that later, and no worries, there's a lot of questions we get that we can't necessarily answer on site, but we'd love to share that with classes after the fact too, if you could. But that's a great start. Cool. All right, Miss Coyle's group, if you guys want to come up, you are good to go.
What is the longest lasting?
Yeah, in grade 9.
Wow.
The longest lasting fire, guys. Yeah. Let's demute you again. I know you just had an announcement. Yeah, the longest lasting prescribed fire or like wildfire?
Wildfire.
Wildfire. Yeah.
The longest lasting wild. Okay.
Yeah.
I will try to get you a specific fire. I don't know if I could give you one off the top of my head, but a few years ago near Sunshine on the border of British Columbia, we had a wildfire that lasted about 2.5 months.
Yeah. It's really interesting, actually, and you guys are growing up in an era where these wildfires are more common. Even when I was a kid, we didn't get major wildfires to the degree that we're getting them. So California, BC, Alberta are all experiencing this, which makes this topic really, really important. All right, Miss Adamson's group, I'm going to take 2 questions from you guys because I know there's like 800 of you. So let's come and we'll take one, and then when you're done with the one, we'll come right back, okay?
So has there ever been an incident where a prescribed fire has gone wrong?
Yeah.
Yeah. So here in the park, thankfully, we haven't had too many that have gone really wrong, but we've definitely had prescribed fires that escape our boundaries. And for example, the year was like 2003 on Fairholme Mountain. We had a prescribed fire that was between the town of Banff and the town of Canmore, so very high visibility. And the fire shifted a bit because of the wind and the temperature, and it started to escape that boundary. Thankfully, what we do is in anticipation of something like that happening, we have so many people on call, both local firefighters, national park firefighters, and provincial wildfighters. Oh, that's a hard word. They're all able to come and help us out as soon as it escapes that boundary. So thankfully, we haven't had anything too bad happen, but it can happen. Yeah.
Great question. One that Mr. Stroder's class also joining on YouTube had asked as well. So I'm really glad we got that covered. All right, Miss Adamson's class, if you guys want to come right back up again, you're demuted. Go for it.
Have people been hurt in the middle of a wildfire?
Yeah, do people get hurt in the wildfires, Alex?
Yeah, sadly it does happen. Wildfires can move very quickly and they can start in the middle of the night, and sometimes it's hard to evacuate people in time. And we have seen that in other areas of the province, and Australia is experiencing that right now. And Australia has actually called on firefighters from all over the world, Canada included, and we're super proud to say that Banff National Park has sent a firefighter there to assist because people are in danger sometimes during wildfires, so they can be damaging and dangerous. You're right.
Yeah. Great question. I'm really glad we got that covered. And there's another one that's been appearing a lot on YouTube, so we're covering questions jointly, which is awesome. Miss Doty's class, if you guys want to come up and represent the entire United States with your question. No pressure. Go for it.
How do you control the fire?
Yeah.
Well, we control the fire all kinds of ways. Some different methods that we'll use is we'll basically make a line around the fire that's free of fuel. So what that means is we'll make a line that doesn't have any plants, it's down to the soil, so that once the fire reaches that point, it can't really travel any further, and that's one way to control the fire. We'll also set up sprinklers. Sometimes we even fight fire with fire, so that's called a backburn, and you will light an area on fire under very controlled conditions, of course. As the fire moves toward the area that's already been lit, all those fuels are gone, so the fire has nowhere else to spread. There's a ton of different ways to control it, but It comes down to a lot of on the ground work, and when we can't be on the ground, sometimes it's by sky using helicopters and planes.
Yeah. We've got some great questions on YouTube. So Miss Friedrich and Miss Bray's class both wanted to ask about animals. Where do they go in wildfires, prescribed fires? Like what happens to the wildlife that's there? Can they escape? Is there somewhere that they can run to? What's going on?
Yeah, totally. One of the biggest questions, you guys nailed it, is what happens to the animals? Now, remember I said that fire has been a part of our landscape for thousands of years? Well, because of that, animals have adapted to fire as well. So the large animals like grizzly bears and deer and elk, they'll actually flee the area once they start seeing the smoke and sensing it. If they get somewhat trapped, they might find an area with water. So in one of the images I showed you earlier, there was deer standing in the river. So that's one way animals escape fire if they can't just flee. Birds will fly away, of course. But then smaller animals like mice, sometimes they'll actually bury under the ground and protect themselves that way. So as the fire moves across the soil, it might not burn all the way down. And so that animal is protected. Generally speaking, wildlife, they escape as well as they can. And most of them do get away. We really don't see a ton of loss with wildlife.
Yeah. Awesome. All right. So guys, we're getting close to the end of the session. So I want to take one more great question from YouTube about you personally, and then we'll go back to Miss Adamson's class because again, they brought in 4 classes today. So I want to give as many kids a chance to ask a question as possible. But a group online wanted to know, how do you become a fire officer? And so I want you to answer that and how you get your job as well, because both are really interesting. And I'd love to highlight to kids how they can actually be involved in setting fires and making these happen and in sharing this work with the public.
Those are great questions. So how do you become a firefighter? Well, most of the provinces hire firefighters every summer because in North America, our fire seasons are growing longer and longer. And so to be a firefighter, one of the most important things is that you're physically fit, because fighting fires is really hard work and you have to carry some really heavy stuff up mountains. And so a really great resource to check out what being a firefighter is like is to go to the Alberta Wildfire YouTube page. Now, the Alberta Wildfire YouTube page actually has entire videos showing how people train to be firefighters. So that's a really great resource for you guys. But it comes down to being really physically fit, working well in a team because you're working in dangerous situations and you need to trust everyone around you, and then understanding fire ecology, something that you can learn in school or even on the job. Now for my job, which is fire communications, what I did was I went to school for environmental science, but that doesn't mean everyone in my role does that. It all comes down to being a good communicator. You need to be able to interact with the public casually like we are interacting today, but you also need to be able to provide information very clearly and quickly in times of wildfire. So it all comes down to communication skills, and you can get that in all types of jobs. So I highly recommend you come into the world of fire. It's super exciting and I love it. Fire's really cool.
Awesome. As we can tell, you are very passionate about this, which is great. All right, I want to take one more question live and then I'll wrap it up with one more question for you personally. So Miss Adamson's class, again, if you guys want to come up, go for it.
Has there ever been a prescribed fire that gotten out of hand?
Yeah, so prescribed fire that's gone crazy. Alex?
Yeah, gone crazy. I wouldn't say that we've had any prescribed fires, thankfully, that have gotten super crazy. But I mentioned earlier that we have seen prescribed fires maybe get a bit larger than we intended. And whenever that happens, we immediately work on suppressing it, so putting it out, because a prescribed fire only works if it's very controlled. So once it gets out of control, we have to put it out to protect human property, values, and human life.
Very cool. All right. And then what I want to wrap up with is, again, both on YouTube and in person, we have way more questions than we could possibly take in a live session of 45 minutes. So where can we point kids to learn more? So I'm going to share the Alberta Wildfire YouTube page with our classes when we're done. And then Banff National Park has a beautiful YouTube page and some other sessions we've done. Is there anything else that jumps to mind where kids can learn about fire, about Banff, about the work you do, anything?
You can definitely check out our YouTube page. So we'll be posting videos there as the year progresses. The Alberta Wildfire, they don't just have firefighter videos, they have all kinds of fire videos, that are super informative. And I love that as a resource even for myself. And then checking out just the Banff National Park website. There's a ton of prescribed fire information on there. So if you search Banff National Park prescribed fire, that's how you kind of get into my world and what's coming up in the next year.
Very cool. Well, Alex, this has been marvelous. And again, I'll pass along the resources to kids when we're done. But what we do at the end of every session, I'm going to demute everyone's microphones. And so boys and girls, if you guys could join me in saying a huge thank you to Alex for joining us today. You are all now demuted. Go for it.
Thank you.
Awesome, guys. I think we broke some mics there with yelling. Yeah, welcome in. Thank you guys so much for joining us today. We love the questions. We'll be sure you guys get the chance to ask even more over the coming weeks and days. And Alex, this was great. Thank you so much for being a part today.
Thank you.
All right, have a lovely rest of your day.